Okay, so I believe we've started. Welcome to the NERI webinar series, Wednesday seminar series replacement. This week we have a great paper. I've just been through it there on trends in post-PUP employment, examining the employment transitions of those closing their pandemic unemployment claims. Of course, this research is very timely as we, come out of, as the dust settles, I suppose, after COVID, as we return, labour markets start returning to normality. What are we looking at? We've heard anecdotal evidence of, recruitment problems. Some of the commentary last year was about the PUP being too high and having difficulties, incentivizing workers back, especially tourism and hospitality got particular attention, at least in public discourse. So what is the what's the data telling us in regards to that? So we have with us today four great researchers. Presenting first will be Jeff Dwan-O'Reilly, who is with the Department of Social Protection and a member of the Irish Governmental Economic and Evaluation Service. He's a labour market economist, and research to date has been focused mainly around COVID, Brexit, and associated government policy responses to these challenges. With them is Michael McNelis. He was a statistician at the Central Statistics Office with a background in mathematics, and he's currently seconded to the Department of Social Protection and involved in the production of statistical information on social welfare services, annual report and quarterly statistic reports. He's also a member of the Irish Government Statistical Service. Later on, joining us to help in the Q&A for anybody who has any questions, we'll have Dermot Corcoran and Roshan Sen as well, both from the Department of Social Protection. So I'll invite any attendees to put any questions into the Q&A function, where I'll put the questions to our panel of four after the presentation. So we're aiming, it's coming up to 3:05 now. We're aiming for somewhere in the region of a 45-minute presentation with 20 minutes afterwards, somewhere in that region, 20 minutes afterwards. So we'll be finished up at the latest by 4:15. So I'll await your questions, and I'll hand it over to Jeff and Michael, whoever's going to start. And thanks for joining us, and thanks for the contribution. All the best.
Thanks very much for the introduction there, Kieran. So first of all, I'd just like to say good afternoon and welcome to everyone joining us online here today. And again, we'd like to thank NERI, Louisa and Kieran for kindly inviting us to hold this event. And we're really looking forward to the discussion and to your questions later on. So our presentation today will be on our recently published working paper, Trends in Post-PUP Employment, which seeks to examine the employment transitions of those closing their pandemic unemployment payment claims. So just a few general housekeeping points regarding this research paper before we get into it. We'd like to thank the Labour Market Advisory Council and colleagues within the department for their helpful comments and advice in this work. The views expressed in this paper are solely those of the authors and do not reflect the views of either the Minister or the Department of Social Protection. All data and associated charts presented here are provisional and subject to revision, and the analysis presented in this paper was conducted in November 2021. In the first section of this paper, we're going to look at the ongoing economic context underpinning this analysis and describe the specific research objectives we hope to achieve. So following the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, Ireland's labour market experienced an abrupt and adverse shock, quite unlike that of any previous recession. To contain the spread of the virus, the government introduced a range of public health measures which mandated the closure of all but essential workplaces and amenities, which resulted in sudden high levels of displacement from work and an unprecedented demand for financial supports from the state. In April 2020, the CSO's COVID-19 adjusted unemployment rate, which is the upper bound for unemployment, peaked at almost 32%, the highest level in the history of the state. In response to this, the government introduced emergency income and employment supports for displaced workers and affected firms, including the pandemic unemployment payment, the temporary wage subsidy scheme, and subsequently the employer wage subsidy scheme, which will be referred to as PUP, TWIS, and EWIS, respectively, going forward. Numbers on these schemes since the start of the pandemic up to the time of our analysis, as well as those on the live register, are shown in the figure here on the slide. In total, by November 2021, these emergency COVID schemes had cumulatively supported over 1.4 million distinct individuals since their introduction. Now, since the acceleration of the government's COVID-19 vaccination campaign in mid-2021, which facilitated wide-scale economic and societal reopening, the Irish labour market has experienced a sharp recovery. As shown here, latest estimates from the CSO show employment has rebounded to above pre-pandemic levels and is now close to 2.5 million people. Similarly, numbers in receipt of COVID supports have declined in this time, particularly with respect to the PUP, which came to an end last week after 2 years. The welcome economic recovery from COVID-19 has posed a number of challenges for the labour market, particularly with respect to labour shortages and skill bottlenecks in some sectors, such as hospitality, construction, or life sciences. And these are occurring not just in Ireland, but they're apparent in advanced economies globally. So some of the likely contributing factors are listed on the slide here. And among them is the simultaneous surge in employer demand for labour, either trying to recruit new workers or attract back former employees that they had previously released during the pandemic. And this has provided workers with more job choice across sectors, and as such, they have more bargaining power, and their preferences are more bargaining power around their preferences, including pay, conditions, and remote working. And another important factor worth mentioning is the lower availability of European and international workers due to reduced labour mobility across borders. And international workers represent an important source of talent supply for many sectors of the Irish economy, particularly the likes of hospitality and ICT services. Measuring the impact of the COVID-19 shock on the Irish labour market and the effects of the pandemic-related income supports is of importance to both researchers and policy makers. Therefore, within the context of the ongoing labour market tightness, the central objective of our research paper is to highlight the extent of employment transitions or movements among former PUP recipients who have closed their claim and returned to work. And by understanding the labour market movements of these people, we can better gauge the scope of labour reallocation and any potential longer-term impacts from the COVID-19 crisis. To do this, we have identified 7 specific research questions. Are there any cohorts or demographics less likely to have exited the PUP to return to employment? To what degree did the PUP maintain employer-employee linkages? So were former PUP recipients evidenced as having returned to their pre-COVID employer after closing their claim? To what extent have former PUP recipients changed employer post-PUP? And if they have remained in the same broad sector pre-PUP or moved to a new sector. And considering the pre-PUP sectors of former recipients evidenced as having returned to work and taking into account the various employment transitions between sectors, which sectors have gained or lost the most in terms of employees. Then considering the employment transitions of individuals from specific sectors, where have people moved to? Are there material differences in demographic characteristics, pre-COVID earnings, or durations on PUP between those that have returned to their pre-PUP employer and those that did not? And finally, to what extent have PUP recipients and employers been reliant on IGEES upon returning to employment? And are there any cohorts that are particularly reliant on? So by addressing these questions, it's hoped to at least partly explain some of the difficulties reported by employers in recruiting in the current economic environment, as well as to gain a better understanding of the transition journey of former PUP recipients back into work. So this next section, we're going to discuss the methodology used in our analysis and provide an overview of PUP to employment transitions. Our analysis was performed in November 2021 in respect of all customers who had closed their PUP claim on or prior to October 5th, 2021. This accounts for approximately 775,000 people. It's important to note that the analysis does not include those who subsequently left the PUP following the further easing of restrictions on October 26th, and nor does it take into account the first tranche of PUP transitions to job seekers terms, which commenced in late October. The analysis used to determine if an individual had returned to work post-PUP involved matching former PUP recipients to employment using the Revenue Commissioner's real-time API, which allows access to payroll data. For the purpose of this analysis, former PUP recipients were considered in employment if they had evidence of at least one payslip in either August, September, or October 2021. Using this approach, we identified 571,000 individuals with evidence of returning to work after their last PUP. This represents 74% of all PUP recipients who had exited over the lifetime of the scheme. It's important to note as well that due to lags in self-employment earnings information, many people who likely exited PUP to self-employment are included in the no evidence of being employment category. And as such, our figures may underestimate the number of PUP recipients back at work. At the time of our analysis, just under 25,500 or 23% of those who self-certified as self-employed pre-PUP had exited the scheme and had been seen back in employment since August 2021. Of these 571,000 individuals that we were able to match using the Revenue real-time API, around 553,000 can be linked to a NACE2 sector based on the economic activity of their employer. Of these, the flow chart here shows that at the time of our analysis, 55% were working for their former pre-PUP employer, 45% were working with a different employer, some in the same broad sector as they worked before PUP, but most are now employed in a new sector. And with regard to sectoral data, there are some important caveats to bear in mind. So firstly, an individual's NACE sectoral classification does not necessarily translate into their occupation. Secondly, because a person's pre and post NACE sector of employment is derived from their last payslip pre-PUP and their latest payslip post-PUP, it's possible that some people may have been misclassified if they were engaged in a number of different but simultaneous employments. And finally, our analysis includes only those with evidence of post-PUP employment in Ireland. So some former recipients may have returned to work but are living or working outside of Irish jurisdiction and would not have been picked up on the Revenue Real-Time API. It's also important for us to consider the 203,000 former PUP recipients who had no evidence of post-claim employment. So of these, 58% were seen to be either in receipt of another selected social welfare claimant or had another likely destination, including self-certifying as self-employed or being in education during the PUP application process. Then this leaves around 85,000 people with an unknown destination post-PUP. And you can see this in the grey section of the chart. So there's a number of possible reasons why it was not possible to match these individuals. So some of these include that they may have exited the labour force. So they may have retired, taken a career break, become a carer, etc., etc. They may have emigrated. They may have exited PUP but are not entitled to regular job seeker payments, or they may have deceased. And of the unknown cohort, almost half received their last PUP before Q1 2021, and almost half were of non-Irish nationality. So in this next section, we investigate the cumulative PUP durations and characteristics of those former PUP recipients that have exited the scheme and returned to work. Former PUP recipients have exited the scheme at various points throughout the pandemic, with most final exits observed during periods of wide-scale economic reopening, such as the summers of 2020 and 2021. In the majority of cases, the underlying driver of an individual's duration on PUP has been the extent to which their pre-PUP sector of employment, and so ultimately their employer, have been restricted from operating under fluctuating public health measures. The figure on this slide shows the cumulative number of PUPs received of those evidenced as having returned to employment. It shows that many were in receipt of the PUP for a relatively short cumulative period of time before return to work, compared to the maximum possible duration, which was 81 at the time of analysis. So for example, 40% of PUP recipients back in work spent 15 cumulative weeks or less on the payment. It's also clear, however, that individuals can still spend long periods of time on PUP and return to work, albeit that this is less common. From a policy perspective, there's a potential danger of labour market scarring among those who, at the time of the analysis, have not been able to exit the payment despite wide-scale economic reopening. Looking next at sectors, it's clear that there's been a substantial disparity in the impact of COVID-19. Customer-facing and contact-intensive sectors, such as accommodation and food or retail trade, have been the most affected, with smaller sectors such as arts and personal care services also hugely impacted. The data shows that individuals entering the PUP from these sectors have had the longest average cumulative duration on the PUP. As shown in the red dots in the charts, on the chart here, the proportion of total PUP recipients evidenced as being back in employment also varies by sector. Interestingly, despite being among the most impacted sectors, 75% of all recipients who entered the PUP from the accommodation and food sector have closed their claim and been recorded back in work. In contrast, Lesser impacted sectors such as finance and insurance are among the least likely to have been recorded back in work, albeit absolute numbers are quite small for this sector. Sorry. The distribution of former PUP recipients evidenced as having returned to work varies across age brackets. However, a clear trend does exist. The younger an individual, the more likely they are to have exited the PUP and been evidenced back in employment. This is shown by the red dots in the figure here. Our analysis shows that 80% of all young people under the age of 25 who received a PUP have been seen in employment between August and October 2021. This highlights the resilience and responsiveness of this cohort to take up opportunities once they arise, especially given their likelihood to work in those sectors most impacted by public health restrictions, namely hospitality, retail, etc. In contrast, only 52% of all older PUP recipients, so those over 55, have been recorded as being back in employment. This is, however, in line with historic labour market trends where older workers can typically struggle to regain their footing in the labour market once made unemployed as a result of a labour market shock. As such, it's unsurprising that the oldest workers have been among the slowest to exit PUP upon economic reopening. With respect to the older age groups, it's also important to bear in mind that a higher proportion of these individuals self-certified as self-employed pre-PUP, many of whom have, at the time of the analysis, exited PUP. Although we have no payslip evidence, these individuals may have returned to their self-employment, and as such, our figures may somewhat underestimate the number of older individuals back in work. Finally, on this slide, we just give a quick overview of some of the other demographic breakdowns that we examined. With respect to nationality, for example, the vast majority of PUP recipients have been Irish. As shown by the red dots here, non-Irish individuals appear to have been proportionally less likely to have been back in employment in Ireland than their Irish counterparts, although there is some variation. Looking next at region, we can see that despite Dublin having the largest absolute number of former PUP recipients back in work, proportionately, recipients from Dublin have been the least likely to exit the payment to return to work. This can possibly be explained by the unique concentration of business activities and occupations in the capital, such as hospitality, tourism, arts, and support services. Finally, with respect to gender, the data shows that men have been slightly less likely to be seen in work post-PUP than women. The higher proportion of men working in self-employment is likely to be an explanatory factor here, though, however. So the next section explores by sector the extent to which people have availed, who availed of the PUP, have returned to work for their former employer or who have changed employment either within their former sector or to a different sector. And I'll now hand over to my colleague, Jeff, to take you through this section.
Thanks very much, Michael. So in this slide, the flowchart tries to give an overview of former PUP recipients' employment destination upon returning to work after the PUP. Looking first at the left branch, we can see that of those that have been recorded as being in work post-PUP, 71% or 390,000 returned to work for the pre-PUP employer at some stage after closing their claim. Of these, at the time of our analysis, 78% were still working for the pre-PUP employer, while 22% had moved to a new employer elsewhere. Looking now at the right branch, we can see that 29%, or over 163,000 former PUP recipients now back in work, show no evidence of returning to the pre-PUP employer. Of all those moving to a new employer, more than 2/3 or 69% were seen to move into a new sector, while the remaining 31% stayed within the same broad sector as that in which they worked prior to PUP. In the following few slides, we will take a more detailed cross-sectoral view of some of these cohorts, starting with those who returned to their pre-PUP employer at any time since their exit. So as mentioned already, 71% of those back in work were evidenced as receiving at least one payslip from the pre-PUP employer since exit. If we dig a little deeper here, we can see that from the gold dots in the chart, the manufacturing, health and construction were the sectors with the highest proportion returning to the pre-PUP employer. In comparison, ICT and admin and support services were the lowest. The data would appear to suggest that the PUP retained the employer-employee connection for the majority of former recipients evidenced as having returned to work. This was the central design rationale underpinning the wage subsidy schemes. As time progresses, however, we see that more individuals who initially returned to the pre-PUP employer subsequently moved to new employers. This is consistent with natural labour market churn. Almost 87,000 people who originally returned to their pre-PUP employer have since moved elsewhere. Next, we examined 249,000 or 45% of individuals who exit PUP and were, at the time of the analysis, working with a different employer. As shown in the chart, the sectors with the largest percentage of former PUP recipients working in a new employer were ICT and admin and support services. Those in manufacturing and other services, including personal care, were the least likely to exit PUP and subsequently take up employment with a new employer. Reflecting the impact of the pandemic on the sector, accommodation food was the largest in absolute terms, with 50% or 64,000 of former PUP recipients who previously worked in the sector now working with a new employer. Of those recorded as being with a new employer from their most recent payslips, 66% had no evidence of returning to their former pre-pandemic employer since receiving their last PUP payment. Finally, in this slide, we look at the 171,000 individuals who have changed employer and now working in a new sector of employment. This equates to approximately 69% of all people with a new employer, or 31% of all those evidenced as returning to work post-PUP. Once again, as shown by the green bar here, accommodation food saw the highest absolute number of former PUP recipients move into a new sector of employment, over 41,000. Proportionately, however, as shown by the gold dots in the chart, those from the public administration, real estate, and arts, entertainment, and recreation sectors were the most likely to move into a new sector of employment if changing employer. Of these, the arts sector had the highest absolute number of individuals moving to a new sector of employment post-PUP, approximately 5,700. In this next slide, we look at individuals' pre- and post-PUP sector of employment at an aggregate level. Taking into account the various post-PUP movements between sectors, it is clear that there has been considerable movements. In general, those sectors most impacted by COVID-19 and the associated restrictions have been those which have seen the largest net losses in terms of former PUP employees into other sectors. This net loss or gain of former PUP recipients in employment in each sector is shown by the difference between the green and gold bars in the chart here. Looking at the most striking example, we can see that the number of individuals that exited PUP having joined from the accommodation food sector is much higher than the number of individuals that exit the payment and now work in the sector, according to their latest payslip. The net impact of this sectoral transition is a loss of almost 26,000 paid employees in the accommodation food sector, or a net decrease of about 20%. However, other sectors less impacted by COVID-19, such as healthcare and public administration, have seen positive net increases in the number of employees. While many of the transitions observed among former PUP recipients will be permanent in nature and are undoubtedly contributing to the labour shortages being experienced in some sectors, others may be only temporary. In particular, this might be for those sectors that at the time of the analysis continue to be impacted by COVID-19 and the remaining health restrictions, including hospitality, bars, nightclubs, as well as arts and entertainment. So building on the previous slides, the next section examines more closely the intersectoral employment movements of foreign PUP recipients that have changed employer. In doing so, we can get a better understanding of where people have moved to relative to the pre-PUP sector. The sectors we'll examine here are accommodation, food, construction, and arts. So starting with accommodation food, at the time of the analysis, 128,000 of those known to have originally joined the PUP from the sector had exited the payment and returned to work. Of these, 50% were working for their pre-PUP employer and 50% were working for a new employer. The chart across shows the sector destinations, both in terms of number and proportion of those who have changed employer. Of those that have changed employer, 36% were working for a new employer but remained in the accommodation and food sector, and 64% had moved to a new sector. The largest destinations of foreign PUP recipients who were leaving the accommodation and food sector were to wholesale retail trade and admin and sports services. The data shows that approximately 10,000 people who worked in hospitality pre-PUP have moved to work in retail. It is perhaps unsurprising that such a significant share of exits from accommodation and food have moved to the retail and trade sector, as many of the transversal skills needed in hospitality, including customer service, are also essential in retail. As such, they would be amongst the most suitable candidates to fill vacancies in the retail sector and vice versa. It should be noted also that the accommodation food sector is likely to have amongst the highest rate of natural labour market churn. A significant share of those working in the sector do so for a relatively short period of time compared to some other sectors. This is driven to a large degree by the high proportion of younger people who work in the sector and whose employment is generally transitory in nature. Looking next at the construction sector, over 65,000 of those known to have originally joined the PUP from the sector have exited payment and returned to work. Of these, 64% were working for their pre-PUP employer and 36% were working for a new employer. Of those that had changed employer, 47% were working for a new employer but remained in the construction sector, while 53% had moved into a different sector. The largest destinations for foreign PUP recipients leaving the construction sector were public administration and manufacturing. Of any sector, construction has the highest proportional level of retention of former PUP recipients, with 81% still working within the sector as of their latest payslip. The high share of individuals deciding to remain within the sector makes sense because the highly specialized skill set of many in the construction occupations, which are not really transferable to other sectors. PUP recipients from the construction sector on average also had higher weekly earnings pre-PUP. So this might have acted as a disincentive for moving elsewhere post-PUP. Finally, if you look at the arts, entertainment and recreation sector, we know that 13,000 of those known to have originally joined from the PUP had exited payment and returned to work. Of these, 51% were working with their pre-PUP employer and 49% were working for a new employer. Of those that had changed employer, 12% were working for a new employer but remained in the arts sector, while 88% had moved into a different sector. The largest destinations of former PUP recipients leaving the arts sector were wholesale retail trade and accommodation and food. It is telling that arts, entertainment and recreation is one of the only sectors where more people changing employer were moving to another sector, such as retail, than remaining within their own original sector. This reflects the difficulty those businesses in the industry have had in operating even under low-level public health restrictions. As a consequence of these restrictions, there has been a lack of employment opportunities for those seeking to return to work in the sector. As mentioned earlier, however, it is possible that some of these transitions among former PUP recipients will be only temporary in nature, and that the full lifting of restrictions since this analysis was conducted has perhaps made it possible for some to return to their original sector. In the next section, we examine the characteristics of different cohorts who are evidence of returning to work post-PUP to see whether these can provide some intuition as to their decisions and employment destinations. The characteristics we consider are age, the cumulative duration on the PUP, and average pre-PUP weekly earnings. The first comparison we consider is between those that return to their pre-PUP employer at any stage after their final PUP versus those who never returned to their pre-PUP employer. The data shows that those that never returned to their pre-PUP employer since their exit from the scheme were more likely to be part of a younger demographic, have a longer cumulative duration on the PUP, and have lower average pre-COVID weekly earnings compared to those that did return at any stage. Aware of the potential interdependence between these variables, these findings make intuitive sense. For example, younger workers have the greatest labour market mobility and are most likely to take up alternative opportunities once they become available. Older workers, in comparison, have more time responsibilities, loyalty to their employer, and specialization within their fields, which makes them less likely to move. With respect to the duration on PUP, the data shows here that the longer an individual is away from the employer, the more the pre-existing employer employee link declines. It may also show that the longer one is on the PUP, the greater the financial necessity becomes to find alternative employment. And lastly, it's understandable that lower paid employees are less likely to return to their pre-PUP employer than higher paid sectoral counterparts. The current buoyancy of the labour market means that lower paid people are more likely to be attracted by better paid jobs that arise elsewhere. In this slide, we compare the two groups working with a new employer. Those who changed but remain in the same sector as they worked pre-PUP versus those working with a new employer in a new sector. Similar to the previous slide, the data shows that those working for a new employer in a new sector were more likely to be part of a younger demographic and have substantially lower average pre-COVID weekly earnings compared to those that were working for a new employer in the same broad sector as they worked pre-PUP. Again, these findings are understandable. Younger workers are usually the most amenable to change. This is because they're at the start of their careers and are not particularly specialized in any one field or occupation, with many open or indeed preferring to sample a number of jobs before deciding on a career path. Similarly, lower paid individuals are more open to take up job opportunities in other sectors compared to the higher paid sectoral counterparts. These higher paid individuals may be more specialized in their field and therefore more likely to seek opportunities within their sector so as to further their chosen career. The second to last section of our paper examines the degree to which former PUP recipients evidence having returned to employment are being supported by the Employment Wage Subsidy Scheme. In examining the interactions between these two schemes, it is important to note that while both the IGEES and the PUP were targeted towards supporting the working age population through the pandemic, they are quite different in nature and design. The IGEES essentially acts as employment support to help businesses retain workers on their payrolls, whereas the PUP was designed as a direct income support to those who lost their job as a result of the pandemic. As such, individuals have flowed between the two schemes at different points during the pandemic, with flows driven by the changing severity of public health restrictions at various points in time. For example, as shown in the chart here, outflows from EWIS to the PUP were at their highest in periods where restrictions were most severe, such as in January. Conversely, inflows to EWIS from the PUP tended to increase as restrictions eased. This is indicative of people gradually moving back into employment and can be seen from March 2021. As individuals exit the PUP to return to employment, a significant portion were returning to employers that were supported by the EWSS. In October 2021, of the 539,000 former PUP recipients evidenced as being in employment in that month, over 145,000, or 27%, were in jobs supported by the EWSS. As shown by the red dots in the chart, there has been a declining trend in the proportion of former PUP recipients supported by EWIS month on month. The decline might suggest that employers of former PUP recipients are gradually becoming less reliant on the EWIS for retaining their staff, or that more former PUP recipients have transitioned to non-subsidized employment. In any case, it appears that the EWIS has allowed impacted employers to rehire staff during recovery. In doing so, it has acted as an important mechanism back into employment for some former PUP recipients. It is also useful for policymakers to ascertain to what degree total monthly EWIS numbers are comprised of former PUP recipients. Our analysis shows that of all those benefiting from EWIS in October, 50% were former PUP recipients. This increased slightly from each of the months prior. The upward trend here would appear to suggest that while overall numbers of former PUP recipients on EWIS are decreasing, they are doing so at a slower rate than all other EWIS recipients. This can be understood, however, given that those former PUP recipients on EWIS at the time of our analysis were employed in those sectors most impacted by the pandemic, and as such, were therefore in need of continued financial assistance from the state. As shown by the gold dots in the figure across, accommodation, food, arts, and personal care services all had a high proportion of former PUP recipients being supported by the EWIS in October. For example, 71% or 70,000 of all former PUP recipients evidenced as working in the accommodation and food sector were in receipt of an EWIS supported payslip in October. These individuals accounted for almost 25% of all those supported by EWIS at the time. From a policy perspective, it is important to be aware of this sector reliance in the context of current winding down of supports, as it highlights the potential impact on particular sectors and on the employment outlook of those it currently supports. The final section of today's presentation concludes and discusses plans for future research in the area. In terms of labour market developments, the findings of this paper indicate the extent of employment churn among former PUP recipients in the Irish labour market as the economy recovers from COVID-19, with some sectors experiencing considerable net losses in terms of labour, while others have gained. While there is likely to be a number of factors underlying these movements, including increased job opportunities and changed employment preferences among workers, this analysis can, at least partly, provide some evidence and intuition to the ongoing labour shortages in some sectors. In terms of future research, given that the PUP was still in existence at the time of this analysis was conducted, the results, although insightful, can only be considered as provisional. With that in mind, we plan to refresh this analysis again in the near future, when the scheme has ended. Future analysis will therefore present a more complete picture of all individuals' post-PUP employment situation. In addition, the next iteration of this working paper will be better placed to provide a more detailed insight regarding those who have not been able to return to employment during the economic recovery from COVID-19. I think that just about brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your time today, and we're very glad to hear your thoughts on this work or answer any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
Michael and Jeff, thanks a million. There's a lot to unpack there. Very comprehensive, and obviously we will look forward to the updated version. As you know, I keep using this term a lot, as the dust settles. I mean, as long as hopefully we've no return to any restrictions anyway, and the first quarter of 2022 will be, you know, the first normal quarter we've had in a while that we can actually look at these things without restrictions, and obviously quarter two will be without the supports. So yeah, we've one question here now from the, and I'll invite Roisin and Dermot to, if you want, turn on your cameras there, and invite you to jump in here if you want. And I'm sure you can see the question there. Given the high inflow from PUP to EWSS, are people more likely to return to former employer if they went that route, or if you left PUP naturally, were you more likely to find a new employer?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you there, Roisin.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that Jeff or Michael might be best placed to answer this in the first instance, and I might jump in after them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question, actually, and I don't think it's something that we've really looked into too much in this paper. But yeah, that would be a really interesting thing to look at in the next version. So something that we'll definitely keep in mind. I don't know if anybody else on the panel any views on that.
Well, go ahead, Roisin.
No, I was going to say, I suppose the question saying that are you more likely, is the question really saying, are you more likely to return to your former employer if you went from PUP? I'm actually not sure, because we're saying there's a big inflow from PUP to EWIS. And so is that saying from the beginning? Because I suppose EWIS has been around for a while now. So I'm not sure whether it's the same. I'm not sure if we're looking at the same thing.
Yeah, it might be a research question for your for the next one. So I'll just put, I've been of interest. I saw recently, and you mentioned the churn rate in different sectors, and there's a figure from 2015 is the latest from the CSO, and that, you know, I think what it means is it's 0.51, and accommodation and food was 0.51, excuse me, and was way ahead of any of the other sectors. It was a sectoral churn rate. So my interpretation of that is that like about 50% of accommodation food workers in a year tend to move on. So actually what we see here with the return to former employees seems less of a churn than there were in normal times. Whereas, you know, a lot of the understanding, the public understanding of this stuff, and you know, there was an article there recently about 40,000 a 40,000 shortage of staff for accommodation and food. So I found that very interesting. Of course, the latest figures from the final quarter of 2021 show that still a huge amount of I think it was 2 and 3 employments in that sector are supported by EWSS, which translated to 45% of the entire wage bill of the entire sector. So, you know, what does that say, or what do you think that might say for going forward?
Yeah, I can start off here maybe. Yeah, accommodation food hugely reliant on EWIS at the minute. So it's something that policymakers will definitely have to be aware of as the support is withdrawn, and of the kind of people that are in that sector. It's hard to know what the withdrawal of EWIS will mean for a sector in terms of the employment levels. Will there be a lot of layoffs? It's very hard to tell at this point, I think. But yeah, it's something it's such an outlier in terms of the EWIS supports. Yeah, it's something that we'll just have to keep an eye on, I think.
There's another interesting question. Oh, sorry, Roshan, if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, just to add to that, I suppose the central bank quarterly forecast bulletin came out today as well, and they talked about the combination now of the increased cost for employers alongside the having to pay the full wage bills as a result of these supports being withdrawn. So I suppose still consistent to what Jeff was saying about the need to be able to monitor what's happening. So we are conscious of, I suppose, for us in the department, we can monitor PUP very easily because it was a scheme that we made payments on. We don't have that same overview and oversight over EWIS, and that's something that that we're trying to see how we can get a better overview of that data, because now that we've reached the end stage of paying out PUP, the next big thing is going to be the withdrawal of EWIS and what impact that has on those businesses. So yeah, we want to get a sense of what's happening there.
Yeah, there's obviously with inflation being, you know, international as well, that's a storm on the horizon, particularly for that sector. I mean, what's the first thing you might cut back on? Never mind the domestic, you know, demand for that sector. You know, people start cutting back on going to restaurants and going to pubs, etc., etc. So that's an issue on the horizon. I would note as well, but like, you know, and this is a question from Ness and Vaughan here, and it's a question that I've, you know, wondered about in terms of the framing of public conversation on this throughout. You know, these are low wage workers. We see younger people again. I like that figure there. 80% of, you know, just some of the, you know, some of the way we view young people. I think public discourse in Ireland is, you know, is not supported basically by these statistics. They got up, they went to work when they had the chance. I also noticed in the Eurostat data, the latest Eurostat data, that actually for the employment rate for 15 to 24-year-olds went up by a load, like even relative to before. And I saw it like a little bit of the dynamic there is there's fewer foreign nationals, because you have that in the Eurostat data, fewer foreign nationals working in services or working generally than there were, especially under 40. Foreign nationals under 40. So we heard that anecdotally about people going home. Of course, you think of Deliveroo drivers, you think of waiters and waitresses and stuff like that, especially in Dublin. And we've seen that kind of that slack seemingly picked up by Irish, you know, who mostly will be students, I think, and a lot of it's going to be temporary, or at least a good chunk of it. So the question, sorry, long-winded intro to Nesson's question. So what's the evidence to suggest that the PUP payment acted as a disincentive to people returning to work? And we heard that opinion being stated quite frequently. So has anybody got any comments on it? Did I answer?
I'm politely waiting to see if Jeff wants to go first. If not, I'll jump in.
Let you go for Roshan this time.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Well, I suppose the way there has been commentary around PUP being a disincentive to work, and I suppose what this paper shows is the extent to which people have exited, which is very high, and also into employment, which is, you know, which is high. Now, we do know that there's still a number of people who remained on PUP till the end, who are long-term recipients, and there's, you know, potential scope for thinking that people remained in the payment. But there were adaptations to the payment as it went on. So I suppose, like, initially it started off at the 203 rate, then we realized it was staying on for longer and we went up to 350, and then it was to everybody. But then as soon as it was staying for longer, we changed it so that it was adjusted to wages, that people wouldn't be, you wouldn't be like a better off, really. You'd be better off working than you would be in receipt of PUP, compared to what your previous wages would have been. So I suppose in terms of what we did in the department for the design of PUP was to make sure that it didn't act as a disincentive to work. We were very conscious of it not operating on that basis. And I'm not sure, like, when you look at how people have come off it, like, there hasn't been, you know, big surges of people like in the previous transitions. Now the most recent live register figures are going to come out at the end of this week, but we haven't seen like big surges of people onto the live register and staying on job seeker payments at the end either, as the previous transitions have happened. So it doesn't seem to me that people are trying to remain on payments. It does seem that people have been exiting to employment whenever the economy reopened. And we can see that now when we look at our unemployment rate, we're pretty much at a rate that you'd consider to be full employment, pretty much, you know. So like there isn't much of a wriggle room there. So I don't think that the evidence is there from my perspective to say that it's been acting as a disincentive to employment, but I'm sure that there would be people who would disagree. I'm not sure what your views are on this, and Kieran.
I just wonder what, so we have, there's a few of the, not historically, in the last say decades, there's some places where we've already heard of problems in recruitment, construction, for instance, nursing, and then it seems certain skill sets within accommodation, food now. So at the moment, as far as I can see, it's anecdotal. I saw in summer 2019, and I wrote a little blog about it, or summer 2021, the numbers have pretty much returned in sectorally to the employment they had 2 years beforehand. This is in a whole new environment where, we've visitors from America and UK and Europe are down. So I found that interesting. Now, the nature of the occupations within that sector, that's what the anecdotes are saying, that the chefs especially and stuff like that. So what would you say to an employer? Like, what is the policy response, or what is the response of employers to that, if that indeed is the case? I sometimes wonder if it's, I know Jeff mentioned things like temporary, these might be temporary. This is a snapshot in time. Obviously, these things it takes a long time to hire back 100,000 people into a sector. So is that what we're seeing? And at the same time as well, is it a bad thing? You're hearing a lot of things. Well, I saw a poster on the deli counter there for a job advertisement as if this is a signal of a dysfunctional labor market with imbalances in the difference between minimum wage and social welfare payments and all that. So with that said, like what's the role for policymakers in kind of trying to facilitate training or how do we tackle it?
Yeah, and you're right, there are definitely sectors having difficulty in recruitment, and there's no disputing that. I suppose the question is whether that's because of the existence of PUP or not. So I suppose in terms of the impact that social welfare payments have had on it, so I suppose what the department does is, for anybody who's in receipt of a payment, there's engagement. We do lots of work with employers in terms of doing recruitment events for them as well. We do lots of there's job fairs, there's open recruitment days, there's stuff that we do with EURES to try and get people who are coming from, to encourage people from other countries like within the EU to fill vacancies that are in evidence in Ireland. And I suppose the issue is that we're not the only country facing these challenges. Like it is an international phenomenon of countries having difficulty in recruitment in different occupations, because there's just an overall we just need more workers, really. And I suppose there is also the question about the quality of work that's being offered as well, whether if there aren't consistent hours and if the pay is low, it is difficult for somebody to regardless of what social welfare payments you're on, it's difficult to want to take up that type of work as well. You'd want to make sure that the work that's being offered as well is attractive, and then there's career progression and things like that there. So I suppose there's work to be done on our side for sure to make sure that, and within Pathways to Work, which is the National Employment Services Strategy, we have a number of commitments to make sure that we reduce unemployment durations and the number of people who are unemployed. But I suppose a part of that is, so I suppose we're conscious of what we can do to improve our social welfare payments to make sure that it always pays to work. So there's kind of work ongoing on that side. But there is also the other side as to what employers can do to make their occupations and the work that they offer more attractive.
And you mentioned it's an international issue. Is there are the occupations, are they the same occupations that countries like? From my understanding, I'm probably putting in a theory myself here, but the chefs that went home, did they go home to Italy, France, Brazil maybe, and are those countries also having the same problems with chefs, construction workers,
healthcare? Yeah, healthcare.
So it's international with the same occupation.
Yeah. So exactly. So when we have Yeah, so when we do these like EURES events, which is like the European Public Employment Service, so there's a network, and Ireland would be one of the countries in the network, and they have these like European Open Job Days and things like that. Everybody's competing, like pretty much, or a lot of the countries are competing for the same occupations. So, and then I suppose one of the difficulties that we'd have then is that you'd want to make sure that we can attract, like, why would somebody want to come to Ireland, you know? So it's to try and make Ireland a good place to live and for people to come here.
Well, there's probably an imbalance, especially in the cities, which will probably have a disproportionate amount of the tourism as well, in terms of the cost of living, attracting people, I'd imagine, especially, you know, rent has gone up over the last 2 years as well. The house cost of living, obviously inflation is an issue. Maybe people feel safer at home. We've another question here from Ailish Kelly. Thanks first of all to the two presenters, Jeff and Michael, for a very interesting piece of research and very comprehensive. Have the researchers examined the characteristics of those that were still on PUP at the time point of their analysis? From a labour market activation perspective, risk of long-term unemployment, the characteristics of these individuals and those that transition to a job seeker payment when this commenced and when the PUP scheme closed will be important to examine.
Yeah, so I can take that one to start anyway. So if we look maybe at the characteristics of those who got the payment last week, so the very last cohort, that kind of 45,000 group, I think 38% of them were in the Dublin region, 60% were male, about less than 10% were under 25, but there was a good proportion, maybe 20%, that were older workers. And then in terms of their duration on the payment, I think maybe over 90% had 52 or more cumulative payments in total. So for that kind of cohort in particular, we'd be really watching to see how they can go back to work and what supports they might need, because they're kind of structurally long-term unemployed.
And just on that, I suppose, to build on what Jeff was saying, is that we would be very conscious in the department of the fact that the people who are still on PUP as time went by and as the economy reopened and recovered would be the people who'd be most at long-term risk of becoming long-term unemployed as the scheme ended. And as Jeff said, they already would have been, like, in many ways would be considered long-term unemployed on the basis they haven't been in the labour market for this length of time, for over a year. So we've already set up that people, as they transition to job seeker payments, for those who are eligible, that you know, the employment services are there to engage with everybody as they come in, to develop their personal progression plans and identify appropriate training needs and employment supports. And then I suppose we hadn't anticipated last year how much the economy would have recovered. I suppose at the time the Pathways to Work was being drafted and the time the budget was being considered, look, we couldn't have envisaged how well the economy's recovered in terms of the number of people who are in employment and how low the unemployment rate would be. So we actually have very adequate provision in terms of our employment supports, and our case officers we've increased by like 100 in the last year. So we're well set up to be able to engage with everybody who's coming off the pandemic unemployment payment and moving on to job seeker supports, to be able to provide the supports that are needed, because this is a cohort of long-term unemployed. And one of the things that was done in the department was to change. So for a lot of our schemes, you would need to be long-term unemployed or have a certain length of time to be in receipt of a job seeker payment in order to qualify for them. So what the department has done is that the time spent on PUP counts towards that. So it does mean that for the vast majority of people who are coming off the pandemic unemployment payment now, moving into job seeker payments, they'll all be eligible for the range of supports that are provided by the department. So in that sense, I think the department is very well set up to provide support to everybody who's transitioning.
I have a quick question myself, and then there's one from I suppose Tom or Paul. I'm not too sure exactly who it is. Actually, I'll go to that one first. So the PUP and the EWSS seem to have been effective in preserving productive capacity. You know, that's a mistake we kind of might have made in 2008. Were these policies uniquely appropriate to the COVID recession, or should they form perhaps modified part of a toolbox for future recessions? I just want to add a little bit to that, because I was fascinated by the movements of former employees in arts and entertainment, and that there, a lot of them were going into other very low wage areas, and this week we had an announcement of a UBI or a basic income for artists. So just in respect to that, is this have we learned valuable lessons here for the future, for possible other pandemics or possible other crises like this?
Do you want me to go for this, Jeff?
Yeah, if you want to start away, I'll hop in afterwards.
Oh, no, you go first if you want to.
Well, I think that the PUP and the EWIS, there's an awful lot of lessons that can be learned kind of from the two schemes. I think it's fair to say that they've been very effective in the COVID response. They're obviously brought in very, very quickly. There might be some questions as to would it have been better maybe to bring in the EWIS before PUP, to try and keep that employer link from the start. But overall, I think they'll probably go to inform any future kind of schemes that are being developed.
Yeah, and I suppose exactly, and just on that though, that the experience that we've had with PUP and EWIS is, so we have a couple of commitments within Pathways to Work to examine developing a short-term work scheme. So retaining something like EWIS, and like, would that be appropriate, and what would that look like? So there is kind of work ongoing in that space. And the other around PUP, I suppose there's some recognition around the fact that Ireland doesn't have a pay-related benefit or a job seekers benefit like most other European countries would. So another commitment for this is in the programme for government, and that is also within Pathways to Work, is to examine looking at a pay-related benefit. And I think the experience that we've had with PUP will inform some of that as well, some of the design work there.
Very good. I have a kind of a technical question, actually, because I've been looking at it, following, I think the last count was we still have somewhere in the region of 250 to 300,000 on EWSS. Is that about right? We have, before in Q4 2019, I think we had about 195,000 people on the live register. Now we have 30,000 less than that, something like that, 165. But at the same time last week, we had 45,000 people still on PUP. So once they, I feel like obviously it's been a strange time, and how do you count the PUP recipient? They're not really unemployed, but they're out of work. They're not unemployed in the sense that they're not seeking work because they can't, because the economy is shut down or whatever. So I'm just wondering, some of the decisions that were made in terms of how we count these things, is that we have officially 100,000 extra working than we did in Q4 2019. Is that real? Is this, do you know what I mean? I feel like some have been treated in a different way, and I don't know if you've come across the same ways. Is that 165,000 going to be up to 210,000 tomorrow, or next time we count social welfare? And what's the unemployment rate really look like, if it does look, if that's not, if as I set it up, it's not really measuring the same thing as it did in 2019.
I might start, and then maybe, I don't know whether Michael wants to come in a bit on the COVID adjusted unemployment rates and stuff like that. I know, like, when the employment figures were going up so much in the last few quarters, Kieran, I was looking at them going, how are they so high? Like, they've just gone up so much, and it does make you just wonder what's happening. I think it's real. Like, I suppose what we'll know is, so I suppose this is going back to the conversation we had around EWIS, and what we'll know what happens as EWIS supports are withdrawn and what impact that has. Because it could well be the case that there are businesses that have been supported that actually, once that support is withdrawn, that that they won't be viable anymore. So we'll have to see what happens with that over time. I do think that it does seem that the figures are real in terms of the employment figures now, but we'll have a sense over the next coming quarters what happens as those supports are withdrawn. on the unemployment figures, again, I think that they are right. Like, we'll have a sense of what happens. The like register figures will come out. The CSO is publishing them at the end of this week. What we've seen in previous transitions from as PUP has been, as people cohorts have been transitioning to job seeker terms, that is it around about half of the people, around like, you know, the way a good proportion of people don't transition to job seeker payments. And there's a combination of people at the time the economy was reopening. So there's a lot of people going into jobs, and then there's other people who wouldn't be eligible for the job seeker payment. So so I wouldn't anticipate that we'd see the full tranche of people from PUP being on the LR.
Yeah, is that, I was wondering about that. That was on one of the slides. When you say not eligible for job seekers, is that like kind of based on household income and stuff like that? Maybe they're a second earner, or maybe the household is over above a threshold, or?
Yeah, it would be a combination now, because they haven't, if they didn't apply for one, but then we don't know really what happened to them in terms of like why they didn't. But you'd imagine it would be things like that that it would be means. And for instance, if you're self-employed on PUP, you could earn like €960 over 8 weeks. But if you're moved on to job seekers allowance, that would be fully accessible. So, you know, the way there are differences in how the two schemes operate. So we wouldn't expect the full transition over. But yeah, in terms of I don't know whether Michael, you want to speak a little bit about the difference between the regular monthly unemployment rate and the COVID adjusted unemployment rate, because again, the difference between the two have been shrinking. So I think that's real as well.
I'll pop in there.
Yeah.
I'll nip in there, Roisin. Yeah, I think just on the context of, you know, that Roisin's point about being two different schemes. I mean, the CSO COVID adjusted unemployment rate was, they always were at pains to say it was an upper bound estimate, and that was because that the cohort that were on PUP strictly didn't meet the conditionality around unemployment that would form part of the job seeker element. And you know, for example, part-time students were entitled to a PUP, but you know, the principal economic status of those people would put them into a different category. And the other element is around, you know, entitlement for job seekers, and the fact that you won't see all 44,000 appearing in the next live reg, is the fact of a number of people on the pandemic unemployment payment were also in receipt of concurrent payments, such as disability allowance and carers allowance and so on. So you know, that again, that principle, or that primary payment element will kick in once they, you know, once the determination of whether they are entitled to job seekers or not will also be a factor.
All right. Well, look, we're hitting the time now. You know, hopefully they are real, Russian. I mean, there's been a huge growth in specific, particularly in information communication technologies. And you know, I was just looking at the dynamics again. It seemed it was mostly over 40s, and it's a male-dominated profession anyway. But it was male-dominated. So I'm just like, even the participation rate, the employment rate, have gone up through this time. Which again, you know, as you said,
So I was going to say, there's a big increase in women in ICT as well, and there's like a big increase in women like 55 to 59 in employment as well. Like, so, and for younger, like even 15 to 19, there's like lots of unusual things happening.
So I wonder if this is like working from home. If this is, you know, because at the start it was the opposite. The CSO had published a specific, you know, employment rate, participation rate. I can't remember exactly which. But for what they called married women, it was on the CSO, and it had dropped off in the first year, you know. And obviously there were issues around childcare there, and that generally tends to fall on the shoulders of the woman. But yeah, hopefully that's high end employment and good for everyone. Hopefully that continues. Look, I'd like to thank all four, Michael, Jeff, Dermot, Roshan. That was a brilliant presentation. As I said, very timely, very interesting, and very important. And we'll, if you don't mind, we'll put that video up on the we recorded the session. We'll put the video up on the YouTube channel. And thanks a million everyone for coming. And we'll hopefully see you at the next one. And oh yeah, by the way, we've our labour market conference coming up in June, and we're taking submissions at the moment for abstracts for anybody who might want to present for us. A 15-minute presentation on we've several themes, so we'd appreciate anybody applying. That's all for now. Thanks a million, and wish you all the best.
Thanks, Kieran.